The Bridge Builder, a Tommy Tuberville story. The autumn wind whipped through downtown Montgomery, Alabama, carrying with it the scent of change and the electricity of impending conflict. Senator Tommy Tuberville adjusted his navy blazer as he stepped out of his black SUV, the Alabama state flag fluttering proudly from the government building behind him. It was October 15, 2024, and what should have been a routine town hall meeting was about to become something far more significant. The crowd had been gathering since dawn. What started as a peaceful assembly of concerned citizens had slowly morphed into something more volatile as the day progressed. Social media had amplified the event, drawing activists from across the state and beyond. Signs bobbed above the sea of people like ships in a turbulent ocean, some supporting the senator's recent controversial stance on military promotions, others demanding his resignation. "Senator, are you sure about this?" asked his chief of staff, Marcus Chen, a sharp-minded Harvard graduate who had been with Tuberville since his transition from coaching to politics. Marcus's usually calm demeanor showed cracks of concern as he surveyed the crowd. "We could move this inside, limit the attendance. The optics would be better." Tuberville shook his head, his weathered face set with determination. At 69, the former Auburn football coach had seen his share of hostile crowds, but nothing quite like this. The recent political climate had created divisions deeper than any he'd witnessed in his decades of public life. "No, Marcus. These people deserve to be heard, all of them." The crowd numbered nearly 2,000, a mix of ages, races, and backgrounds that reflected the changing face of Alabama politics. Veterans in worn military caps stood shoulder to shoulder with college students clutching smartphones. Elderly ladies from the local churches shared space with young professionals who had driven down from Birmingham and Huntsville. At the front of the crowd, a group of particularly vocal protesters had positioned themselves strategically. Among them was Sarah Mitchell, a 28-year-old veteran of the Iraq War who had lost her leg to an IED in 2019. She gripped her sign with white knuckles, the words "Honor Our Military," painted in bold red letters. Beside her stood James Washington, a 34-year-old high school teacher and community organizer whose passionate speeches had helped mobilize much of the opposition to Tuberville's recent actions. "He thinks he can just waltz in here and smile his way through this," James muttered to Sarah, his dark eyes fixed on the senator as he approached the makeshift podium. "After what he's done to military families, after the harm he's caused." Sarah nodded grimly. Her own promotion had been delayed by 6 months due to the political gridlock, affecting not just her career, but her ability to provide for her 2 young children. The personal cost of political games had never felt more real. As Tuberville stepped up to the microphone, a hush fell over portions of the crowd, while others continued their chants. The senator's presence was commanding despite his age. His broad shoulders and confident stance a reminder of his days stalking the sidelines at Auburn. But today, he wasn't facing opposing quarterbacks. He was facing the anger and frustration of his own constituents. "Good afternoon, Alabama," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system. The response was mixed, cheers from his supporters, boos and jeers from his critics. "I know many of you are here because you're concerned about the direction of our country, about the decisions being made in Washington that affect your daily lives." A voice from the crowd shouted, "Then why are you making it worse?" The comment drew both laughter and applause from sections of the audience. Tuberville paused, letting the noise settle before continuing. "I've spent my entire life in service, first as a teacher, then as a coach, and now as your senator. I've learned that the hardest conversations are often the most important ones to have." The tension in the air was palpable. Marcus Chen stood off to the side, constantly scanning the crowd while speaking quietly into his earpiece. Security personnel, both visible and plain-clothed, maintained strategic positions throughout the area. Local police had cordoned off several blocks, and news vans from major networks lined the streets beyond the barriers. "I want to talk to you today about something bigger than politics," Tuberville continued, his voice growing stronger. "I want to talk about what it means to serve, what it means to make difficult decisions even when they're unpopular, and what it means to find common ground in a divided time." Sarah Mitchell shifted her weight on her prosthetic leg, her jaw clenched. The senator's words sounded hollow to her, platitudes from a politician who had never worn the uniform, never bled for his country. She thought of her fellow veterans, still waiting for promotions, still caught in the crossfire of political maneuvering. The crowd's energy was building, like storm clouds gathering before a downpour. Signs waved more aggressively, chants grew louder, and the careful organization of the morning was giving way to something more chaotic and unpredictable. In the back of the crowd, Maria Santos, a 45-year-old nurse and single mother, held her 16-year-old son's hand tightly. She had come hoping to hear something that would restore her faith in the political process, some sign that her representatives still cared about regular working people. Her son Diego was considering enlisting after high school, and the current state of military affairs had her deeply worried. "Mom, maybe we should go," Diego whispered, noticing the increasing agitation around them. "This doesn't feel safe." Maria squeezed his hand but remained rooted in place. "No, mijo, this is democracy in action. Sometimes it's messy, but we need to be here. We need to witness this." As Tuberville continued his opening remarks, addressing his controversial hold on military promotions and attempting to explain his reasoning, the crowd's reactions grew more intense. His supporters appreciated his straightforward approach and his willingness to stand by his principles, while his critics saw his explanations as inadequate justifications for harmful actions. "Senator Tuberville," James Washington called out, his voice carrying across the crowd, "how do you justify putting politics above the men and women who put their lives on the line for this country?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Tuberville looked directly at James, and for a moment the crowd fell silent, sensing the weight of the exchange about to unfold. "I justify it," Tuberville replied slowly, "by believing that sometimes standing up for your principles requires making unpopular choices. I didn't come to Washington to be liked. I came here to represent the values that Alabama sent me there to defend." The response ignited the crowd. Supporters cheered while critics booed loudly. Someone near the front began chanting, "Resign, resign," and others quickly picked up the chant. The careful balance of the gathering was beginning to tip toward chaos. Sarah Mitchell felt her anger rising like bile in her throat. The senator's words felt like a slap in the face to every service member who had been caught in his political crossfire. She began pushing forward through the crowd, her prosthetic leg making the journey difficult but not impossible. Her destination, the front of the crowd, where she could look the senator in the eye and tell him exactly what his principles had cost her and thousands of others. The storm was about to break, and everyone present could feel it coming. The tension that had been building all morning finally reached its crescendo as Sarah Mitchell pushed through the crowd, her determination evident in every difficult step. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the assembled masses, adding physical discomfort to the emotional heat that was rapidly rising to dangerous levels. "Senator Tuberville," Sarah called out as she reached the front barrier, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "I'm Sergeant Sarah Mitchell, United States Army. I served 3 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan." The crowd around her fell silent, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Even Tuberville's supporters seemed to recognize the gravity in her voice, the weight of experience behind her words. "I lost my leg serving this country," Sarah continued, her voice steady despite the emotion churning beneath the surface. "And I lost 6 months of my career because of your political games. 6 months that I'll never get back. 6 months that affected my ability to provide for my children." Tuberville's expression softened as he looked at her, seeing not just a protester, but a veteran who had sacrificed more than most could ever understand. "Sergeant Mitchell," he began, "I want you to know that I have the utmost respect for your service and your sacrifice." "Respect?" Sarah's voice cracked with anger. "If you respected me, if you respected any of us, you wouldn't have held up our promotions as political pawns. You wouldn't have turned our careers into bargaining chips for your ideology." The crowd behind her was growing more agitated by the second. James Washington had worked his way closer to the front, his own anger feeding off Sarah's pain. Other veterans in the crowd were nodding in agreement, their faces reflecting years of frustration with politicians who claimed to support the troops while playing games with their lives. "You sit in your comfortable office in Washington," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger, "making decisions about people you've never met, lives you've never lived. You've never worn the uniform, never felt the weight of carrying a weapon in a foreign land, never wondered if you'd make it home to see your family again." Tuberville stepped closer to the edge of the stage, his security detail tensing but not intervening. "Sergeant, I understand your anger. I understand that my actions have had real consequences for real people. That weighs heavily on me." "Does it?" The question came from James Washington, who had now reached the front barrier next to Sarah. "Because from where we're standing, it looks like you're more concerned with your political career than with the people you're supposed to represent." The exchange was being broadcast live on multiple news networks, and the crowd was growing larger as word spread through social media. What had started as a town hall meeting was rapidly becoming a national moment, a crystallization of the frustrations that had been building across the country. Marcus Chen was frantically coordinating with security, his earpiece crackling with updates from law enforcement. The situation was volatile, and he could see it spiraling beyond their ability to control it. But Tuberville seemed determined to engage, to face the anger head-on, rather than retreat to safety. "I want to tell you something," Tuberville said, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "I've made mistakes. I've made decisions that have hurt people I never intended to hurt. But I've also made those decisions because I believe in something bigger than political expedience." "What could be bigger than the lives of the people who serve this country?" Sarah shot back. "What principle is worth more than the careers and families you've disrupted?" Before Tuberville could respond, the mood of the crowd shifted dramatically. A group of counter-protesters had arrived, supporters of the senator who had organized online and were now trying to push through to show their support. The two groups began to clash at the edges of the gathering, with shouting matches quickly escalating to pushing and shoving. "This is exactly what's wrong with politics today," called out Maria Santos from somewhere in the middle of the crowd. "We can't even have a conversation without it turning into a war zone." Her words were nearly lost in the growing chaos, but they reflected the sentiment of many who had come hoping for dialogue rather than confrontation. The careful organization of the morning was completely gone now, replaced by the raw emotions and tribal loyalties that had come to define American political discourse. A young man in a red MAGA hat pushed past Sarah, shouting at Tuberville, "Don't let them bully you, Senator! Stand your ground!" His aggressive movement caused Sarah to stumble, her prosthetic leg making it difficult to maintain her balance in the crush of bodies. That stumble was the match that lit the powder keg. "Get your hands off her," James Washington roared, immediately moving to help Sarah while simultaneously confronting the young man who had pushed past her. Other veterans in the crowd surged forward, their protective instincts triggered by seeing one of their own threatened. The security personnel finally began to move, but the crowd had grown too large and too volatile for them to effectively manage. Local police officers who had been stationed at the perimeter began pushing into the crowd, trying to create space and prevent the situation from escalating into violence. In the middle of the chaos, Tuberville made a decision that would define not just this day, but potentially his entire legacy. Instead of allowing his security detail to whisk him away to safety, he stepped down from the platform and began walking directly toward the confrontation. "Senator, no!" Marcus Chen called out. But Tuberville was already moving, his security team scrambling to keep up while maintaining some semblance of protection. As the senator approached the front of the crowd, Sarah Mitchell stood her ground despite the chaos swirling around her. Her eyes met Tuberville's, and in that moment, both of them seemed to recognize that they were standing at a crossroads that would determine whether this day would be remembered for division or for something entirely different. The crowd pressed in around them, voices raised in anger, fear, and frustration. News cameras captured every moment, broadcasting the scene live to millions of viewers across the country who were watching democracy strain under the weight of its own contradictions. And then, in a moment that no one saw coming, something happened that would change everything. A protester near the back of the crowd, overcome with rage at what he saw as Tuberville's betrayal of military families, worked his way forward with grim determination. His name was Robert Chen, no relation to Marcus, a 42-year-old factory worker from Tuscaloosa, whose son had been deployed to Syria during the promotion freeze. Robert had been drinking since morning, his anger fueled by alcohol and months of watching his son's career stagnate while politicians played games. As he pushed through the crowd, his intentions became clear to those around him, but in the chaos, no one could stop what was about to happen. He reached the front just as Tuberville was extending his hand to help Sarah Mitchell, who had stumbled again in the press of bodies. Without warning, without a word, Robert Chen spat directly in the senator's face. The crowd fell silent, as if a switch had been thrown. The entire gathering, thousands of people strong, seemed to hold its breath as they processed what had just happened. Tuberville stood frozen, saliva dripping down his cheek, his hand still extended toward Sarah. What happened next would be talked about for years to come, analyzed by political scientists and historians as a pivotal moment in American political discourse. Because instead of recoiling in disgust, instead of allowing his security team to tackle the man, instead of retreating to safety and letting the situation explode into violence, Tommy Tuberville did something that surprised everyone, including his greatest critics. He wiped his face with his handkerchief, looked directly at Robert Chen, and said quietly but clearly, "Sir, I understand your anger, and I want to hear what you have to say." The silence that followed Tuberville's words was deafening. In a crowd of nearly 2,000 people, you could hear the flutter of flags in the Alabama breeze and the distant hum of traffic from the cordoned-off streets. Robert Chen stood frozen, his face a mask of shock and confusion, clearly not having expected this response to his act of ultimate disrespect. Sarah Mitchell, still struggling to maintain her balance in the press of bodies, found herself staring at the senator with a mixture of disbelief and grudging curiosity. James Washington, who had been ready to physically intervene against anyone threatening the veteran, now stood equally stunned by the senator's reaction. "Sir," Tuberville continued, his voice carrying clearly in the hushed crowd, "what you just did was disrespectful, and under normal circumstances it would be unforgivable. But these aren't normal circumstances, are they?" Robert Chen's hands trembled as the full weight of his actions hit him. The alcohol that had fueled his anger was now making him feel sick, and the thousands of eyes on him seemed to bore through his soul. "My son," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "Your son serves," Tuberville said, taking a step closer despite his security team's obvious discomfort. "And you're afraid for his future. You're angry because you feel like I've played politics with his life." The crowd remained transfixed, many pulling out their phones to record what was unfolding. News cameras zoomed in, capturing every nuance of the extraordinary exchange. This was not the political theater they had expected to cover. "Sergeant First Class Marcus Chen," Robert said, his voice growing stronger, "2nd Infantry Division. He's been eligible for promotion to Master Sergeant for 8 months. 8 months of watching his peers in other branches advance while he's stuck because of your political stand. Marcus Chen, the Senator's Chief of Staff, stepped forward upon hearing the name. Senator, if I may. But Tuberville held up a hand, never taking his eyes off Robert. Your son has served with honor, and he deserves better than to be caught in political crossfire. You're right about that. The admission sent a ripple through the crowd. Sarah Mitchell found herself leaning forward, straining to hear every word. This was not the response she had expected from the man she had come to confront. Mr. Chen, Tuberville continued, I want you to know that what you just did was wrong. But your anger, your frustration, your love for your son, those things aren't wrong. Those things are what make you human. Robert Chen's eyes filled with tears as the senator's words hit him. I'm sorry, Senator, I've never done anything like that before in my life. I believe you, Tuberville replied simply. And I want to ask you something. Will you give me a chance to explain my position? Not to excuse it, not to justify the harm it's caused, but to help you understand why I made the choices I made? The crowd began to murmur, some calling for Robert's arrest, others urging the senator to continue. James Washington, who had spent months organizing opposition to Tuberville's policies, found himself genuinely curious about what the senator would say next. Your son is deployed in Syria right now, Tuberville continued, somehow knowing details that surprised even his own staff. He's leading a squad of 12 soldiers, and every day he puts their safety before his own. That's what real leadership looks like. Robert nodded, unable to speak, as emotion overwhelmed him. I held up those promotions because I believe that our military leadership needs to focus on military matters, not social engineering. I believe that when we start making military decisions based on political correctness rather than military effectiveness, we put soldiers like your son at risk. The crowd's reaction was immediate and divided. Supporters cheered while critics booed, but Tuberville continued speaking, his voice never rising, never becoming defensive. But here's what I've learned from this experience, he said, his eyes never leaving Robert's face. Good intentions don't erase harmful consequences. My belief in a principle doesn't justify the pain I've caused to families like yours. Sarah Mitchell felt her anger beginning to transform into something else. Not agreement, necessarily, but a recognition that she was witnessing something rare in modern politics, genuine accountability. Sergeant Mitchell, Tuberville said, turning to address her directly, you called me out for never wearing the uniform, and you're right. I've never felt the weight of that responsibility. But I have felt the weight of responsibility for young people, as a teacher, as a coach, and now as a senator. And I've learned that sometimes the hardest part of leadership is admitting when you're wrong. The crowd was absolutely silent now, hanging on every word. Even the news commentators providing live coverage had fallen quiet, recognizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Mr. Chen, Tuberville said, returning his attention to Robert, I want to make you a promise. I'm going to personally review your son's promotion packet. If he deserves to advance, and from what you've told me about his service, I believe he does, then I'm going to do everything in my power to ensure that happens. Robert Chen broke down completely, tears streaming down his face as the weight of months of worry and anger finally found release. Senator, I can't believe, after what I just did to you, what you did was wrong, Tuberville repeated firmly. But what I've done to your family was also wrong, and between those two wrongs, maybe we can find a way to make something right. James Washington, who had come prepared for battle, found himself grappling with a completely different kind of confrontation. This wasn't the political theater he had expected, where sound bites and gotcha moments ruled the day. This was something messier and more human. Senator, James called out, his voice carrying across the crowd. "That's a nice gesture for Mr. Chen's son, but what about the hundreds of other service members who are still caught in your political stand?" Tuberville nodded, acknowledging the question. "You're right to ask that, and you deserve an answer. What I'm about to say isn't going to make everyone happy, but it's the truth as I see it." He paused, looking out over the sea of faces, knowing that his next words would likely define his political future. "I still believe in the principles that led me to take my original stand. I still believe that our military should focus on military readiness above all else. But I've also learned that holding fast to principles while people suffer real consequences isn't leadership, it's stubbornness." The crowd erupted in response. Cheers from some quarters, boos from others, but underneath it all a sense that something fundamental had shifted in the dynamic of the day. "So here's what I'm prepared to do," Tuberville continued as the noise died down. "I'm prepared to lift my hold on military promotions, effective immediately, while we work on a different approach to addressing my concerns about military policies." The announcement sent shockwaves through the crowd and across the news networks broadcasting the event. This was not what anyone had expected when the day began. Sarah Mitchell stood stunned, hardly believing what she had just heard. After months of deadlock, after all the anger and frustration, the solution had come not through political maneuvering or media pressure, but through a moment of human connection born from the ugliest possible beginning. Marcus Chen, the chief of staff, was already on his phone, coordinating with Washington to begin the process of lifting the holds. The logistics would be complicated, but the decision had been made in a moment of moral clarity that surprised everyone, including the senator himself. "This doesn't solve everything," Tuberville continued. "There are still deep disagreements about the direction of our military and our country, but maybe, just maybe, we can find a way to disagree without destroying each other in the process." As the senator spoke, Robert Chen found himself surrounded by people offering comfort and support. Not all of them, but enough to remind him that even in his darkest moment, he wasn't alone. Sarah Mitchell reached out and touched his shoulder, a gesture of solidarity between two people who had been hurt by the same policies. The day was far from over, but already it had taken turns that no one could have predicted. And the most surprising developments were yet to come. News of Senator Tuberville's announcement spread like wildfire through social media and traditional news outlets. Within minutes of his declaration to lift the military promotion holds, reactions were pouring in from across the political spectrum. The immediate aftermath of the crowd's initial shock was giving way to something more complex, a mixture of hope, skepticism, and the kind of political calculation that inevitably follows unexpected moments of apparent sincerity. In the crowd, Maria Santos pulled out her phone and immediately called her husband, Carlos, who was at work at the aerospace plant in Huntsville. "Carlos, you need to turn on the news right now," she whispered urgently, trying not to disturb the ongoing dialogue between Tuberville and the gathered citizens. "What's happening, mi amor?" Carlos asked, concern evident in his voice. "I think we just witnessed something that's going to change everything," she replied, her eyes never leaving the senator as he continued to engage with individual citizens in the crowd. Diego, her 16-year-old son, was live streaming parts of the event on TikTok, his commentary providing a younger generation's perspective on the unfolding drama. "Guys, I don't know about politics usually, but this is actually crazy," he whispered into his phone. "This old politician just got spit on, and instead of freaking out, he's actually talking to people like they're human beings." The ripple effects extended far beyond Montgomery. In Washington, D.C., Senator Tuberville's colleagues were scrambling to understand the implications of his announcement. Some saw it as a betrayal of conservative principles, while others viewed it as a pragmatic response to untenable political pressure. Senator Elizabeth Warren, one of Tuberville's most vocal critics on the issue, was caught off guard by the news while in a committee meeting. "If this is genuine," she told reporters afterward, "then it represents exactly the kind of leadership we need more of in Washington, the ability to admit when you're wrong and change course." Back in Montgomery, the crowd had evolved into something resembling a town hall meeting, with citizens lining up to share their stories and concerns directly with the senator. Security personnel had managed to create a more organized structure, but Tuberville insisted on maintaining the direct personal interactions that had defined the afternoon. Robert Chen, still visibly shaken by his earlier actions, found himself in an impromptu conversation with Sarah Mitchell and James Washington. "I can't believe I did that," he kept repeating. My wife is going to kill me when she sees this on the news." Sarah, despite her earlier anger, found herself offering comfort to the man. "We all have breaking points," she said quietly. "The important thing is what happens next." James Washington, meanwhile, was grappling with his own conflicted feelings. As a community organizer, he had spent months mobilizing opposition to Tuberville's policies. The senator's apparent about-face left him wondering whether to declare victory or remain skeptical of political promises. "This could all be political theater," he said to Sarah and Robert. "Politicians say a lot of things when they're under pressure. The real test will be whether he follows through." "You're right to be skeptical," came a voice from behind them. They turned to see Marcus Chen, the senator's chief of staff, approaching with a tablet in his hand. "But I want you to know that we've already begun the process of filing the paperwork to lift the holds. The Senate will receive formal notification first thing tomorrow morning." James studied the young man's face, looking for signs of deception. "And after the news cycle moves on, after the cameras are gone and the political pressure eases?" Marcus met his gaze steadily. "Then you'll have to hold us accountable. That's how democracy is supposed to work, isn't it?" Meanwhile, at the front of the crowd, Tuberville was engaged in a lengthy conversation with Margaret Holmes, an 82-year-old World War II veteran's widow whose grandson had been affected by the promotion freeze. Her weathered hands gripped a faded photograph of her late husband in his army uniform. "Senator," she said in a voice that carried the weight of decades, "my Harold always used to say that a man's word was the only thing he truly owned. Once you gave it away carelessly, you could never really get it back." Tuberville nodded solemnly. "Your husband was a wise man, Mrs. Holmes. And you're right, words matter. That's why I want to be very clear about what I'm promising and what I'm not. I'm promising to lift these holds because the human cost has become clear to me. I'm not promising to change all of my political positions, because that would be dishonest." The elderly woman smiled slightly. "That's all we can ask for, Senator. Honesty and the courage to admit when you've made a mistake." As the afternoon wore on, the nature of the gathering continued to evolve. What had begun as a confrontational protest had transformed into something resembling a genuine town hall, with citizens sharing personal stories and the senator responding with a level of engagement that surprised even his own staff. Television news anchors struggled to categorize what they were witnessing. "This is unlike anything we've seen in modern political coverage," CNN's Anderson Cooper observed during live coverage. "We're watching what appears to be genuine political accountability happening in real time, without scripts or spin doctors." On Fox News, the reaction was more mixed. "Senator Tuberville has always been a straight shooter," said Tucker Carlson during his evening show. "But we have to ask whether he's being manipulated by a mob or whether he's showing the kind of leadership that puts people before politics." The social media response was equally divided. Tuberville Spitgate began trending, but the hashtag encompassed vastly different interpretations of the day's events. Some viewed it as a victory for grassroots activism, others as an example of political weakness, and still others as a rare moment of genuine human connection in an increasingly polarized political landscape. Back in Montgomery, as the sun began to set and the crowd started to thin, the core group of participants found themselves in ongoing dialogue. Robert Chen had sobered up completely and was now mortified by his earlier actions, but also grateful for the unexpected grace he had received. "Senator," he said, as Tuberville prepared to wrap up the event, "I want to apologize again for what I did. It was inexcusable." Tuberville looked at him steadily. "Mr. Chen, what you did was wrong. But what came out of it, this conversation, these connections, this opportunity for all of us to remember our shared humanity, maybe that's what matters now." Sarah Mitchell, who had arrived that morning seeking confrontation, found herself in the strange position of defending the senator to some of her fellow veterans who had watched the events unfold on television and were calling her phone with mixed reactions. "I don't agree with all of his politics," she told her friend Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Williams during a brief phone call. "But I saw something today that I haven't seen in politics in a long time. Someone willing to admit they were wrong and change course." As the formal part of the event concluded, small groups continued their conversations in the fading daylight. Local restaurant owners, seeing an opportunity to serve the community, began setting up food trucks and coffee stands. The confrontational atmosphere of the morning had given way to something that felt more like a community gathering. James Washington found himself in an unexpected conversation with several of Tuberville's supporters, people he had viewed as political opponents, but now saw as fellow citizens with legitimate concerns and perspectives. They didn't agree on everything, or even most things, but they were talking, really talking, in a way that had become rare in American political discourse. "This doesn't solve everything," James told a reporter from the Montgomery Advertiser. "We still have deep disagreements about policy, about the direction of the country, about a lot of things. But today showed me that it's possible to disagree without being disagreeable, to fight for what you believe in without losing your humanity." As night fell over Montgomery, the participants began to disperse, but many carried with them a sense that they had witnessed something significant, not just a political reversal, but a reminder of what democratic discourse could look like when people chose to see each other as human beings rather than political enemies. The question that remained was whether this moment of connection could survive the return to normal political operations, or whether it would be remembered as a brief, shining exception to the rule of modern American politics. 3 months after that extraordinary afternoon in Montgomery, the ripple effects of what the media had dubbed the spitting incident continued to reverberate through American political discourse. Senator Tommy Tuberville had indeed followed through on his promise. The military promotion holds had been lifted within 48 hours of his announcement, and hundreds of service members had received their long-delayed advancements. But the story's impact extended far beyond the immediate policy reversal. In an era of increasing political polarization, the events of that October day had become a touchstone for discussions about civility, accountability, and the possibility of finding common ground in an increasingly divided nation. Robert Chen sat in his modest living room in Tuscaloosa, a framed letter from Senator Tuberville's office hanging on the wall beside his son's military portraits. The letter confirmed that Sergeant First Class Marcus Chen had been promoted to Master Sergeant, but more importantly to Robert, it represented something he had never expected to receive from a politician. A genuine apology and a kept promise. "I still can't believe I did that," Robert confided to his wife Linda as they watched the evening news. "Spitting on a United States senator. God, what was I thinking?" Linda squeezed his hand. "You were thinking like a father who was worried about his son's future. It doesn't excuse what you did, but it explains it. And look what came of it. Marcus got his promotion. And maybe more importantly, you helped start a conversation that needed to happen." The conversation Linda referred to had indeed taken root in unexpected places. The video of Tuberville's response had been viewed millions of times, shared across political divides, and analyzed by everyone from political scientists to Sunday school teachers. Universities began using it as a case study in conflict resolution, while leadership seminars incorporated it into discussions about crisis management and authentic communication. In Montgomery, Sarah Mitchell had returned to her job as a logistics coordinator at the local Veterans Affairs office, but she carried with her a renewed sense of possibility about political engagement. The promotion she had been waiting for had finally come through, allowing her to better provide for her children, but the experience had given her something equally valuable: hope that the political system could still respond to genuine human need. "I went there that day ready for a fight," she told her colleague, Vietnam veteran Bill Martinez, as they processed paperwork for other veterans seeking benefits. "I thought the only way to get through to politicians was to shame them, to attack them, to make them feel as powerless as we felt. But what I learned is that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is recognize someone else's humanity, even when they've hurt you." Sarah had been invited to speak at several veterans events about her experience, and her message consistently focused on the importance of civic engagement without losing sight of shared values. "We can disagree about policy," she would tell audiences, "but we have to remember that on the other side of every political position is a real person with real concerns and real feelings." James Washington had perhaps been the most transformed by the experience. The community organizer who had spent months mobilizing opposition to Tuberville's policies found himself reconsidering his approach to political activism. He hadn't abandoned his principles or his criticism of policies he disagreed with, but he had developed a more nuanced understanding of the people behind those policies. "I realized that I had been fighting caricatures instead of engaging with real people," he reflected during a podcast interview about political organizing in the modern era. "When you reduce your opponents to stereotypes, you lose the ability to find common ground or to change minds. That doesn't mean compromising your values, but it does mean recognizing that the people who disagree with you might have legitimate concerns and experiences that inform their positions." James had begun incorporating what he called dignity-centered organizing into his community work, focusing on building bridges even while advocating for policy changes. The approach had proven surprisingly effective, leading to productive conversations with conservative community leaders who had previously dismissed his efforts as partisan attacks. For Senator Tuberville himself, the experience had been both politically costly and personally transformative. His decision to lift the military promotion holds had drawn sharp criticism from some conservative colleagues and supporters who viewed it as capitulation to mob pressure. His approval ratings among his core base had taken a hit, and there was already talk of potential primary challenges in his next election. But Tuberville seemed genuinely unconcerned about the political ramifications. In a follow-up interview with 60 Minutes 3 months after the incident, he reflected on what the experience had taught him about leadership and service. "I spent 30 years as a football coach," he told correspondent Leslie Stahl, "and the one thing I learned is that you can't fake authenticity. Players can sense when you're being genuine and when you're just playing a role. I think the American people have that same instinct." When Stahl asked whether he regretted his decision to lift the holds, Tuberville didn't hesitate. "I regret that it took a man spitting in my face to wake me up to the real consequences of my actions. I regret that families like the Chens suffered while I was standing on principle, but I don't regret changing course when I realized I was wrong." The interview had been watched by over 15 million people, making it one of the most viewed political segments in the show's recent history. Social media reactions were predictably divided. But even Tuberville's critics acknowledged something different in his demeanor, a willingness to engage with difficult questions without deflection or political spin. Maria Santos and her son Diego had also been changed by their experience that day. Diego had decided to enlist in the army after graduation, inspired partly by meeting veterans like Sarah Mitchell and seeing firsthand the dedication of people who chose to serve. But he had also been influenced by witnessing what he described as real leadership in action. "I always thought politicians were just liars who said whatever they thought people wanted to hear," Diego explained to his high school government class during a presentation about civic engagement. "But that day I saw someone admit they were wrong and actually do something about it. That's the kind of leader I want to be, whether in the military or wherever life takes me." Maria had become more involved in local politics, attending city council meetings and volunteering for voter registration drives. The experience had reminded her that democracy required active participation, not just periodic voting. "Democracy isn't a spectator sport," she would tell her friends. "We have to show up, we have to engage, we have to hold our representatives accountable. But we also have to remember that they're human beings, just like us." The Montgomery Town Hall had spawned similar events in other cities, though none had quite captured the unique chemistry of that October afternoon. Politicians from both parties began experimenting with more direct, unscripted engagement with constituents, though many lacked Tuberville's willingness to truly listen to criticism and respond authentically. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a political scientist at Auburn University, had written extensively about what she termed the Montgomery model of political engagement. Her research suggested that the key elements of that successful encounter, authentic vulnerability, willingness to admit error, and recognition of opponents' humanity, could be replicated, but only by leaders genuinely committed to putting people before politics. What we saw that day wasn't about party affiliation or ideology, Dr. Rodriguez explained during a symposium on political communication. It was about fundamental human decency and the courage to acknowledge when our strongly held beliefs are causing real harm to real people. That kind of moral courage is rare in any era, but it's particularly precious in our current political climate. The incident had also influenced how journalists approach political coverage. Several major news organizations had begun experimenting with what they called solutions journalism, focusing not just on conflicts and controversies, but on examples of successful problem-solving and bridge-building. The Tuberville story had demonstrated that audiences were hungry for examples of political leaders behaving with dignity and genuine accountability. Margaret Holmes, the elderly veteran's widow who had spoken with Tuberville during the town hall, had passed away peacefully in her sleep 2 months after the event. Her grandson, whose delayed promotion had been part of the military holds, spoke at her funeral about the letter she had received from Senator Tuberville shortly before her death. She kept that letter on her nightstand, he told the gathered mourners. Not because she agreed with all of his politics, but because it represented something she thought was disappearing from our country. The ability to admit when you're wrong and try to make things right. She said it gave her hope for my generation. The letter, which the family later shared with the Montgomery Advertiser, had been handwritten by Tuberville himself. In it, he thanked Mrs. Holmes for her wisdom and for reminding him that political positions should never lose sight of human consequences. "Your husband would be proud," he had written, "not just of his military service, but of the woman he married and the values she continues to represent." As winter turned to spring in Alabama, the immediate media attention around the Montgomery incident had faded, but its influence continued to spread in quieter ways. High school civics teachers incorporated videos of the event into their curricula. Church groups used it as a starting point for discussions about forgiveness and reconciliation. Community organizations began experimenting with Montgomery-style town halls that emphasized listening over speech-making. Robert Chen had begun speaking at substance abuse counseling groups, sharing his story as an example of how anger and alcohol could lead to actions that seemed unthinkable in sobriety. His message wasn't political, it was personal, focusing on the importance of finding healthy outlets for frustration and the possibility of redemption even after serious mistakes. "I'm not proud of what I did," he would tell the groups, "but I'm grateful for what came out of it. I learned that grace can come from the most unexpected places, and that sometimes our worst moments can lead to our best opportunities for growth." Sarah Mitchell had been appointed to a State Veterans Affairs Advisory Committee, where she advocated for policies that would prevent the kind of bureaucratic delays that had affected her and thousands of other service members. Her approach, informed by her experience with Tuberville, emphasized collaboration over confrontation. "You catch more flies with honey than with vinegar," she would tell fellow advocates. "That doesn't mean you don't stand up for what's right. It means you remember that the people you're trying to influence are human beings with their own pressures and perspectives. If you can help them see the human impact of their decisions, you're more likely to create lasting change." The political establishment in Washington had taken note of the Montgomery incident, though reactions varied widely. Some viewed it as an aberration, a lucky convergence of circumstances that couldn't be replicated. Others saw it as a model for a different kind of political engagement, one that prioritized problem-solving over point scoring. Senator Tuberville's colleagues had mixed reactions to his transformation. Some respected his willingness to change course when presented with compelling evidence of harm. Others worried that his example might encourage what they saw as weakness in the face of political pressure. But for Tuberville himself, the political calculations seemed less important than the personal growth he had experienced. In private conversations with staff, he often returned to the moment when Robert Chen spat in his face and how his instinctive response had surprised even himself. "I could have had that man arrested," he told Marcus Chen during one of their regular strategy meetings. "I could have used it as an example of the incivility of my opponents." But something in his eyes, something in that moment, made me realize that his anger was coming from a place of love. Love for his son, love for his country. How could I respond to that with anything other than respect? Marcus, who had initially worried that his boss's response would be seen as political weakness, had come to view it as perhaps the strongest leadership he had ever witnessed. "It takes real courage to admit you're wrong in front of 2,000 people and millions more watching on television," he reflected. "Anyone can stand firm when they're being attacked. It takes a different kind of strength to acknowledge that the attack might be justified." As the one-year anniversary of the Montgomery incident approached, organizers began planning a commemoration event. But rather than a political rally or victory celebration, they envisioned something more reflective, a community conversation about the lessons learned and the work still to be done. The planned event would bring together many of the original participants: Robert Chen, Sarah Mitchell, James Washington, Maria Santos and her son Diego, and others who had been part of that transformative afternoon. Senator Tuberville had agreed to participate, not as the featured speaker, but as one voice among many in an ongoing dialogue about democracy, civility, and the possibility of finding common ground in divided times. "That day changed all of us," Sarah Mitchell observed during a planning meeting for the anniversary event. "Not just our opinions about specific policies, but our understanding of what's possible when people choose to see each other as human beings rather than political opponents. The question is whether we can keep that spirit alive beyond the moment of crisis that created it. The answer to that question would depend not just on the leaders they elected, but on the daily choices made by ordinary citizens in their interactions with neighbors, colleagues, and strangers whose political views differed from their own. The Montgomery incident had shown that transformation was possible, but sustaining that transformation would require ongoing commitment from everyone involved. As Robert Chen prepared for the anniversary event, he reflected on the journey that had brought him from that dark moment of anger and desperation to a place of hope and purpose. "I'm not the same man who spit in that senator's face," he told his wife. "That man was consumed by anger and frustration. This man understands that even our worst moments can become opportunities for grace, if we're willing to accept it and learn from it." The letter from his son, Master Sergeant Marcus Chen, arriving from his latest deployment, seemed to confirm that assessment. "Dad," his son had written, "I heard about the anniversary event, and I'm proud of you for being part of it. What you did that day was wrong, but what you've done since then, the way you've used that experience to help others and to show that people can change, that's the father I've always known you could be." The story that had begun with an act of disrespect had evolved into something much larger, a reminder that democracy depends not just on institutions and laws, but on the willingness of ordinary citizens to engage with each other across political divides with dignity, honesty, and hope. Whether that lesson would endure beyond the specific moment that created it remained to be seen, but for those who had lived through it, the Montgomery incident would always represent proof that even in the most polarized times, human connection remained possible. As the sun set over Montgomery on the eve of the anniversary, the participants in that extraordinary day prepared to gather once more, not to relitigate old grievances or claim political victories, but to continue the work of democracy in its truest form, the ongoing effort to build a society where disagreement need not lead to dehumanization, where accountability could coexist with forgiveness, and where the courage to admit error could become a source of strength rather than weakness. The spitting incident had lasted only seconds, but its impact would resonate for years to come, a reminder that in a democracy, every moment of human interaction carries the potential to either bridge divides or deepen them. The choice, as it always has been and always will be, belongs to the people themselves. Epilogue. 5 years later, the bronze plaque mounted on the steps of the Montgomery courthouse read simply, "In memory of those who choose dialogue over division, October 15, 2024. It had been installed not by government decree, but through community fundraising, a grassroots effort that had brought together people from across the political spectrum who had been touched by the events of that transformative day. Dr. Elena Rodriguez stood before the plaque on a crisp autumn morning, leading a group of graduate students from Auburn University on what had become an annual pilgrimage to study the site where political discourse had taken an unexpected turn toward humanity. Her research on the Montgomery model had been published in 3 academic journals and cited in countless studies of political communication and conflict resolution. "The remarkable thing about this location," she told her students, "is that nothing about it was special before October 15, 2024. It was just another government building, another political event. But the people who gathered here made a choice to see past their anger and find their shared humanity. That choice is available to any of us at any moment." Among her students was Diego Santos, now a junior majoring in political science and ROTC. The 21-year-old who had live-streamed parts of the original event as a teenager had grown into a thoughtful young man whose senior thesis explored the intersection of military service and civic engagement. His experience that day had shaped not just his career path, but his fundamental understanding of leadership and service. "Professor Rodriguez," Diego asked, "do you think what happened here could happen again? I mean, the political climate seems even more divided now than it was 5 years ago." Dr. Rodriguez smiled, an expression that carried both hope and realism. Democracy isn't about the absence of conflict, Diego. It's about how we choose to engage with that conflict. What happened here wasn't magic. It was people making conscious choices about how to treat each other, even in moments of intense disagreement. Across town, at the Veterans Affairs Office, Sarah Mitchell was training a new group of benefits counselors. Now, the regional director for veteran services, she had built a program that emphasized not just processing claims efficiently, but treating each veteran with dignity and respect. The prosthetic leg that had once been a source of limitation had become, in her mind, a reminder of resilience and the importance of fighting for others who faced similar challenges. "Remember," she told her trainees, "behind every form, every case number, every bureaucratic process is a human being who has served this country. Our job isn't just to follow procedures, it's to honor their service by treating them with the respect they've earned." One of her trainees, a young veteran named Marcus Thompson, who had lost his arm in Afghanistan, raised his hand. "Ms. Mitchell, I've heard about what happened with you and Senator Tuberville. Do you really think one conversation can change how politics works?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "One conversation can't change everything, Marcus, but it can plant a seed. Whether that seed grows depends on whether people choose to water it with continued engagement and good faith efforts to understand each other." At the state capitol, Senator Tuberville was wrapping up his second term with approval ratings that defied easy political categorization. His willingness to work across party lines had earned him criticism from some conservative quarters, but respect from moderates and even some progressives who disagreed with his policies but appreciated his approach to governance. His latest initiative, a bipartisan Veterans Affairs reform bill, had grown directly out of the relationships he had built following the Montgomery incident. Working closely with Sarah Mitchell's advocacy group and veterans from across the political spectrum, he had crafted legislation that streamlined benefit processing while maintaining rigorous oversight of quality and accountability. "This bill represents something that's become rare in Washington," he told the Senate floor during debate on the measure. "It represents the idea that our shared values as Americans are stronger than our political differences. It represents the belief that good policy comes not from partisan victories, but from listening to the people most affected by our decisions." The bill passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, a rarity in an era of increasing polarization. But more importantly to Tuberville, it had the endorsement of veterans groups across the political spectrum, including several that had opposed him vehemently before the Montgomery incident. Robert Chen had become something of an unlikely celebrity in addiction recovery circles, though he remained deeply uncomfortable with any attention. His story of hitting rock bottom and finding redemption through an unexpected moment of grace had resonated with people struggling with their own demons. He spoke regularly at Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, substance abuse treatment centers, and church groups about the power of accountability and forgiveness. "I tell people that the worst thing I ever did led to the best thing that ever happened to me," he would say during his talks. "Not because what I did was good, it was terrible, but because it put me in a position where I had to confront who I had become and decide who I wanted to be going forward." His son, now Colonel Marcus Chen, had returned from his deployment to take a position at the Pentagon, where he worked on military personnel policy. The promotion that had been delayed by his father's activism had proved to be just the beginning of a distinguished career that had taken him from squad leader to battalion commander, to his current role helping shape the next generation of military leadership. The relationship between father and son had been strengthened by their shared experience of that difficult day. "My dad taught me something important," Colonel Chen told a group of junior officers during a leadership seminar. "He taught me that making a mistake doesn't define you. How you respond to that mistake does." James Washington had parlayed his experience with dignity-centered organizing into a consulting practice that worked with political campaigns, advocacy groups, and community organizations across the country. His approach, which emphasized building bridges while still fighting for progressive policies, had proven particularly effective in purple states and competitive districts. The Montgomery incident taught me that you don't have to choose between fighting for your values and treating your opponents with respect, he told a conference of political organizers in Austin, Texas. In fact, the most effective advocacy often comes from recognizing the humanity of the people you're trying to persuade. His work had contributed to several unexpected political successes, including the election of 3 progressive candidates in traditionally conservative districts who had campaigned on platforms of principled compromise and respectful disagreement. Maria Santos had been elected to the Montgomery City Council, where she had championed initiatives focused on community dialogue and civic engagement. Her Neighborhood's First program brought together residents from different backgrounds to work on local issues, using modified versions of the town hall format that had proven so effective 5 years earlier. Democracy starts at the neighborhood level, she would tell anyone who would listen. Before we can fix what's broken in Washington, we have to rebuild the connections that make communities strong. Her success had attracted attention from state-level political organizations, and there was growing speculation that she might run for higher office. But Maria remained focused on local concerns, believing that lasting change had to be built from the ground up. The anniversary commemoration had become an annual tradition, drawing participants from across the country who came to Montgomery to study, reflect, and participate in workshops on political dialogue and community building. The event had grown from a small gathering of the original participants to a 3-day conference that attracted political scientists, community organizers, religious leaders, and ordinary citizens committed to bridging divides. This year's keynote speaker was Dr. John Lewis, Jr., son of the late civil rights leader, who drew parallels between the Montgomery incident and his father's philosophy of getting into good trouble. What we saw 5 years ago, he told the packed auditorium, was a modern example of what my father always taught, that the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice, but only when people have the courage to bend it. Senator Tuberville, Mr. Chen, Sergeant Mitchell, and all the others who participated in that moment made a choice to bend that arc, even when it was difficult, even when it was uncomfortable. The weekend's workshops covered topics ranging from difficult conversations in divided times to building bridges through local action to faith and politics, finding common ground. Participants came from all 50 states and represented every point on the political spectrum, united not by ideology, but by a shared commitment to making democracy work better. As the 5th anniversary weekend concluded, many of the original participants gathered privately at the site of the original town hall. The formal events were over, the cameras were gone, and they could reflect quietly on how far they had all traveled since that tumultuous October afternoon. I still think about that day every time I make a difficult decision, Senator Tuberville told the small group. It taught me that courage isn't just about standing firm in your convictions. Sometimes it's about being willing to change course when you realize your convictions are causing harm. Robert Chen, now 5 years sober and working as a substance abuse counselor, nodded. I learned that grace can come from the most unexpected places and that our worst moments don't have to define us if we're willing to do the work of becoming better people. Sarah Mitchell, whose advocacy work had helped improve the lives of thousands of veterans, added, "The most important thing I learned is that you can fight for what you believe in without losing sight of the humanity of the people who disagree with you. In fact, that might be the only way real change happens." As the sun set over Montgomery, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps where the bronze plaque commemorated their shared moment of transformation, the group stood in comfortable silence. They had all been changed by what happened that day, but more importantly, they had chosen to let that change ripple outward, touching other lives and other communities. The work of democracy, they had learned, was never finished. It required constant vigilance, continuous engagement, and the ongoing choice to see opponents as fellow citizens rather than enemies. But their experience had proven that such work was possible even in the most polarized times, when people had the courage to choose connection over conflict. The Montgomery incident would be studied for decades to come as an example of what was possible when political discourse focused on solving problems rather than scoring points. But for those who had lived through it, the real lesson was simpler and more personal, that every interaction, every conversation, every moment of choice between division and unity carried the potential to change not just individual lives, but the trajectory of democracy itself. The choice, as it always had been and always would be, belonged to the people themselves. And on that autumn evening in Montgomery, as the original participants went their separate ways, they carried with them the knowledge that they had chosen well and the responsibility to keep choosing well, one conversation at a time.